A black teenager stood in court, facing a judge known for his sharp tongue and condescending attitude. "You think you can fool this court?" he sneered. "This is a courtroom, young lady, not a school play." Laughter rippled through the room. The prosecution smirked. The jury exchanged amused glances. But then she spoke. Her voice was steady, unshaken. She began to dismantle the prosecution's case, piece by piece, with razor-sharp arguments and an undeniable knowledge of the law. The laughter died. The smirks faded. And the judge? He was speechless, because Maya Brooks was not just a teenager. She was a prodigy, a legal genius. She had spent years studying the law, debating college students, and preparing for this very moment. And today, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting to expose corruption, to challenge a system designed to silence the powerless. But when you challenge the system fights back. This is the story of a courtroom battle that shook the nation, a battle that tore down one of the most corrupt real estate empires in the country. And just when Maya thought she had won, a shadow loomed over her victory, a warning, a threat, a promise that this fight was far from over. Would she back down, or was this just the beginning? If you believe in fighting for justice, like this video, share it and subscribe for more powerful stories that prove one thing: one person can make a difference. What would you do if you were in Maya's place? Comment below and let's talk about it. Now let's begin. The Superior Court of Chicago loomed over the city like a monument to justice, or to those with the money and power to bend it in their favor. Inside Courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was electric, thick with murmurs and barely concealed amusement. The Pauserher jury box was filled with 12 men and women, a mix of professionals, retirees, and a few younger faces, all watching with varying degrees of skepticism and amusement. A few sat back, arms crossed, whispering to one another, while others leaned forward, curious but unconvinced. The public gallery was more animated. Reporters clutched their notepads, photographers adjusted their cameras, all eager to capture the spectacle that had drawn such unexpected attention. Some were here for scandal, others simply for entertainment, and none of them expected anything more than a public humiliation. And seated at the highest vantage point in the room, towering over the proceedings in his black judicial robe, was Judge Harold Patterson. He was a man who had spent decades in the legal system, and it showed, not just in the deep creases lining his face, but in the absolute authority radiating from his presence. His sharp grey eyes scanned the room with the precision of a predator searching for weakness. His silver hair was combed back meticulously, his posture stiff and imposing, his fingers tapping the bench as though every second wasted was a personal insult. And right now, he was deeply unimpressed. With a slow, deliberate motion, he set his gavel down, exhaling loudly, as if simply acknowledging the scene before him was an exhausting chore. Seated at the plaintiff's table, Teresa Carter, a single mother in her 30s, sat rigid, her hands clutched together tightly. Fatigue clung to her like an invisible weight, her face etched with the exhaustion of someone who had spent too long fighting a battle they were never meant to win. Beside her, Maya Brooks, her unexpected champion, sat poised, a picture of quiet, confidence as she flipped through a neatly stacked pile of documents. At the opposing table, Richard Reynolds, the landlord, lounged with an air of smug assurance. His expensive charcoal grey suit and gold cufflinks were a clear message. He was the kind of man who always won. Beside him, his attorney, Jonathan Cole, looked just as self-satisfied, his expression one of thinly veiled amusement. Judge Patterson sighed dramatically, shaking his head as though personally offended by the absurdity of the moment. Then finally he spoke, "Miss Brooks." His voice was slow, deliberate, laced with undisguised condescension. "Before we waste any more of this court's time, I'd like you to explain exactly what you think you're doing here." A wave of chuckles rippled through the room. Maya didn't move. She met his gaze head-on, unflinching. "I'm representing my client, Your Honor." Judge Patterson blinked once, then let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're what?" Laughter broke out more freely now, rippling through the jury box, the gallery. Even a few junior attorneys who whispered among themselves, Ada Hayes, a seasoned prosecutor with salt and pepper hair and an easy arrogance, smirked as he leaned. toward his co-counsel, Sarah Whitmore, who grinned and shook her head. Cole took his moment. "Your Honor," he drawled, "I must say, I've seen a lot of bold defense strategies in my career, but sending in a child? That's new." More laughter. Someone in the gallery muttered, "What's next? A kindergarten class handling felony cases?" Maya remained still. Judge Patterson turned to Teresa, his gaze softer now but still dripping with impatience. "Miss Carter," he said, "I strongly suggest you reconsider your choice of representation. You are facing a professional attorney who has spent more years practicing law than this child has spent alive. If you want even the slightest chance of keeping a roof over your head, I suggest you find actual legal counsel." The laughter swelled again. Teresa shifted, her grip tightening on the edge of the table. She looked as if she wanted to say something, but how could she argue with a judge? That was when Maya finally moved. She placed both hands on the table, her nails neatly trimmed, her posture poised, her voice steady and unwavering. "Your Honor." The room quieted slightly, not out of respect but curiosity. "My client has the legal right to choose her own representative," Judge Patterson scoffed. "Is that so?" Maya nodded once, completely unfazed. "It is, Your Honor. According to Illinois Supreme Court Rule 756, individuals are allowed to represent themselves in civil matters. My presence here does not violate any laws or procedural rules." The laughter stopped. Cole's smirk twitched. A few of the jurors who had been chuckling moments ago shifted in their seats, as though suddenly realizing this wasn't going to be the joke they had expected. Judge Patterson exhaled sharply, irritation evident. "Fine." He sat back, arms crossed. "You want to embarrass yourself in front of a courtroom full of people? Be my guest. But let me be very clear. If I see even the slightest hint that you are unprepared or wasting my time, I will shut this circus act down immediately." He turned to Cole. "Mr. Cole, I assume you're ready to proceed?" Cole let out a soft, amused chuckle. "Absolutely, Your Honor. This won't take long." He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced smoothness, then strolled toward the center of the courtroom. He turned slightly, glancing at Maya with the kind of smug amusement reserved for people he didn't consider a threat. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I admire your enthusiasm. Really, I do. But let's not pretend you understand the complexities of real estate law." Maya leaned back in her chair, crossing her hands neatly in her lap. "Let's not pretend that you do either." The smirk on Cole's face froze. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Judge Patterson's eyebrows twitched upward. Cole laughed, shaking his head. "Cute." He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, let's be serious. This case is simple. Miss Carter violated her lease. The landlord is well within his legal rights to evict her." Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him like a chess player analyzing a move. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a pristine document. "Funny," she said, "because according to this, the lease agreement states otherwise." She stood, walking with absolute confidence toward the judge's bench. She handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it up to Patterson. Cole frowned, clearly thrown off by her directness. Judge Patterson flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from irritation to something resembling confusion. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Maya's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "From the city's public records office, Your Honor. Unlike the version Mr. Cole submitted, this lease includes an addendum that prevents my client's eviction. Under these circumstances," a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Cole's jaw tightened. Judge Patterson slowly leaned back in his chair, watching Maya with something new in his gaze. For the first time, it wasn't dismissal. It was interest. The courtroom's murmurs, still, buzzed faintly as Judge Patterson leaned back in his chair, gripping the lease agreement Maya had handed him. His once amused expression had shifted to something unreadable, something akin to discomfort. Maya didn't break eye contact. She wasn't just standing her ground, she was taking control of the space. The weight of the moment was undeniable. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line as he reread the document, his eyes darting between the original contract and the altered version the prosecution had submitted. The inconsistencies were obvious, glaring even, and yet, A 17-year-old girl had been the one to catch them. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Who is this girl?" And just like that, the story shifted before she ever stood in that courtroom. Before a judge mocked her and a seasoned attorney scoffed at her presence, Maya Brooks had already been preparing for this moment her entire life. Whether she realized it or not, she grew up in a quiet Chicago neighborhood where the houses were modest, the people hard-working, and the struggles unseen by those who lived in wealthier districts. Her world was not built on privilege or connections. It was built on knowledge and survival. Raised by her grandmother, Clara Brooks, Maya had never known a life of luxury. She had never seen power up close, never witnessed what it felt like to walk into a room and command respect simply because of status. What she had seen, what she had memorized, were laws. Clara, once a dedicated school teacher, had taught Maya the way most kids were taught how to ride a bike, through trial, error, and repetition. But where other children were drilled on spelling lists and multiplication tables, Maya was handed legal books before she even knew how to properly hold them. By the time she was 7, she was reading Supreme Court rulings instead of bedtime stories. By 12, she was debating college students online under an alias. By 14, she had already memorized enough case law to intimidate first-year law students. But Maya had never cared for titles or recognition. She didn't need the world to see her. She just needed to be ready when the world did, and then one day it did. The afternoon that changed everything had started as nothing special. Maya had been helping Clara with groceries, the two of them moving in sync. Clara reading from a handwritten list, Maya reaching for the items without needing instruction. They had been in this tiny corner store on the south side of Chicago countless times before. A place where the cashier knew their names and the shelves were lined with just enough stock to serve the neighborhood. But that day, as Maya stepped toward the register, something caught her attention. A woman, crying. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind of dramatic, attention-grabbing display that demanded people to stop and listen. No, this was the quiet kind of crying. The exhausted kind. The defeated kind. Maya turned her head, her sharp instincts picking up on every detail. The woman stood at the front of the store, one hand clutching a crumpled piece of paper, the other gripping the counter as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, strands falling out in waves of stress. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her lips trembling. "I don't know what to do," she whispered to the cashier, voice thick with barely contained panic. "He's kicking us out. I've paid every cent. I swear I have." Maya froze. The cashier sighed, his voice kind but resigned. "Teresa, you need a lawyer." Teresa Maya's grip on the basket tightened. "I can't afford a lawyer." Teresa's voice cracked. "I don't have anywhere to take my kids. It's just me and them." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Maya knew this story. She had read about it in legal cases, in articles buried in the back pages of newspapers, in reports no one seemed to care about. Landlords exploiting legal loopholes to force out tenants. Illegal evictions disguised as technical violations. Families thrown onto the streets with nowhere to turn, and it was happening right in front of her. Before she could second-guess herself, Maya stepped forward. "Excuse me." Teresa turned, startled. So did the cashier. Maya lifted her chin slightly, forcing her voice to be steady, controlled. "I couldn't help but overhear," she said carefully. "Do you still have your lease agreement?" Teresa frowned, clearly caught off guard by the presence of a teenager inserting herself into the conversation. "Why does that matter?" Maya took a breath. "Because if your lease says what I think, it does, then your landlord has no legal right to evict you." Silence. Teresa blinked at her, then let out a small, bitter laugh. "That's nice, but... Kid, I don't think you understand how this works." Maya's expression didn't change. Something in the way she said it, calm, unshaken, absolute, made Teresa hesitate. Maya took a step closer, lowering her voice. "If you still have your lease agreement, let me see it. If I'm wrong, you'll have lost nothing. But if I'm right..." She let the words hang. Teresa studied her, something unreadable in her tired gaze. "But you're just a kid." Maya smiled faintly, but there was something sharp behind it. "I've been told that before." That night, Maya sat at the kitchen table, her grandmother standing silently in the doorway. Before her, pages and pages of documents were spread. Out, overlapping like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled, Teresa's lease agreement was riddled with inconsistencies. Clauses had been tampered with. The eviction notice was based on a fabricated violation. This wasn't just a bad case, it was an illegal one. Clara finally spoke, her voice low but firm. "You're going to help her, aren't you?" Maya looked up, meeting her grandmother's gaze. She didn't answer right away, because she knew what this meant. It wasn't just writing an angry letter or pointing out a legal flaw. It was stepping into something real, something that would have consequences. But when she did finally speak, there was no hesitation in her voice. "She doesn't have anyone else." Clara studied her for a long moment. Then she simply nodded. "Then do it right." And so Maya wrote a letter, formal and direct, outlining the violations in the landlord's eviction attempt, citing specific state laws that protected tenants from wrongful removal. She sent it, waited, and when the landlord ignored it, she helped Teresa file a case in small claims court. And just like that, Maya Brooks, a girl who had spent her life studying the law from the sidelines, finally stepped into the arena. The Superior Court of Chicago was unusually packed for what should have been a routine tenant-landlord dispute. Courtroom 4B, which usually housed quiet, unremarkable civil cases, had somehow become the center of attention that morning. The jury box was filled with men and women from various backgrounds, middle-aged professionals, retirees, young college graduates, most of whom had walked in expecting a quick ruling in favor of the landlord. But now, some of them shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this case was anything but simple. The gallery was just as engaged. Reporters clutched their notepads, whispering to each other, some already typing furiously on their laptops. The presence of media had turned this into a spectacle, not just a court hearing, but a battle between power and the unexpected force challenging it. And at the heart of it all sat Maya Brooks, the 17-year-old girl whom no one, except perhaps herself, had expected to be here. At the plaintiff's table, landlord Richard Reynolds exuded calculated confidence. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his gold cufflinks gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a silent display of wealth and status. He sat with one leg crossed over the other, leaning back slightly, giving the impression that he was only here because he had to be. Beside him, Jonathan Cole, his high-powered attorney, mirrored his confidence. Cole was a shark in the legal world, and this case, to him, was nothing more than a routine kill. He was the kind of lawyer who could twist words into weapons, who had never lost a case against an unrepresented tenant. And today, he wasn't just against an unrepresented tenant. He was up against a child. Cole barely concealed his amusement as he stole a glance across the courtroom at Maya, a teenager, a girl, a nobody. This would be over before lunch. Or so he thought. Judge Harold Patterson, seated high on his mahogany bench, let out a long sigh. Even though he had already issued a warning to Maya earlier in the hearing, he still had serious doubts about this whole situation. His instincts told him this was a mistake, a waste of time, but something about the way Maya held herself, the unwavering focus in her eyes, made him hesitate before dismissing her outright. "Mr. Cole, you may proceed." Cole rose to his feet with practiced ease, straightening his charcoal grey suit jacket, before turning to the jury with an air of effortless charm. "Your Honor, members of the jury, I will keep this brief because, frankly, there is not much to discuss." He gestured toward Teresa Carter, who sat beside Maya, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Miss Carter signed a legally binding lease agreement with my client, Richard Reynolds. That lease contained clear rules. Unfortunately, Miss Carter has failed to abide by those rules, leaving my client with no choice but to issue an eviction notice." He paced slightly, making sure his words were measured and easy to follow. "Now, I understand that these situations can be emotional, but let's be clear, this is not about morality, this is not about sympathy, this is about contract law, and the law states very clearly that my client is within his rights to remove a tenant who has breached the terms of her lease." Cole turned, flashing a polished smile at the jury. I sympathize with Miss Carter's situation, I really do. But the law is the law. A few jurors nodded slightly, absorbing his argument. Reynolds, sitting comfortably, felt a wave of satisfaction. This was going exactly as expected. Cole returned to his seat, smug and satisfied, and cast Maya a condescending glance. "Your move, kid." Maya did not rush. She did not fumble with papers or hesitate. Instead, she rose smoothly, reaching for a single document from her neatly organized files. As she stepped forward, the air in the room seemed to shift. It was a subtle thing, but the jurors leaned forward slightly. The gallery grew a fraction quieter. Even Judge Patterson tilted his head just enough to suggest that he was now paying attention. Then she spoke. "Your Honor, members of the jury, the prosecution would like you to believe that this case is simple." She paused, letting her words settle. Her voice was clear, steady, and unwavering. "It is not." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Cole's smirk twitched. Reynolds uncrossed his legs. Maya continued, stepping toward the judge's bench with absolute purpose. "This case is not about a lease violation. It is about deception, manipulation, and an illegal attempt to remove my client from her home for financial gain." She reached into her satchel, pulled out a pristine document, and handed it to the bailiff. "This is the original lease agreement. My client signed." Judge Patterson took the document, flipping through it. His expression remained neutral at first, but then his eyebrows knit together. Maya waited. Then she spoke again. "The document submitted by the prosecution is a forgery." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Cole's smug expression faltered. Reynolds sat up straighter. Judge Patterson looked up sharply. "Explain." Maya turned to the jury, her gaze never wavering. "The lease agreement Mr. Cole submitted to this court has been altered. The original contract contains a clause protecting my client from eviction under these circumstances. The prosecution's version has omitted that section entirely." The room grew deathly silent. Judge Patterson's lips pressed into a thin line as he flipped back to the prosecution's document. Jurors glanced at one another. A few reporters scribbled notes furiously. Cole for the first time looked rattled. Maya continued, "This was not an accidental omission, it was intentional, and I can prove it." She turned toward the jury, her voice unwavering, powerful, undeniable. "This case is not about a tenant failing to uphold a lease. It is about a landlord breaking the law." Judge Patterson slowly closed the prosecution's file, setting it aside before folding his hands in front of him. His expression was no longer bored, no longer amused. He looked at Cole. "Mr. Cole, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy?" Cole hesitated. Just for a second. Just long enough for everyone to notice. His mouth opened, but before he could speak, Maya struck again. "Your Honor, if I may, I would like to call for an independent document analysis." A low murmur spread through the room. Cole gritted his teeth. "This is unnecessary." Maya tilted her head slightly. "Then you shouldn't be worried." Silence. The judge exhaled through his nose. Then he looked at Maya, and for the first time that day, he did not see a child. He saw a threat. He saw a contender. And in that moment, as the courtroom buzzed with uncertainty, everyone in the room, from the jury to the gallery to Richard Reynolds himself, finally realized the truth. Maya Brooks wasn't here to lose. She was here to win. The courtroom still hummed with tension long after Judge Patterson had ordered an independent document analysis. For the first time since the trial had begun, Richard Reynolds was no longer in control. The look in his cold, calculating eyes had changed. It was no longer the smug amusement of a man who thought he had already won. Now there was something else. Irritation, caution, maybe even the first flicker of fear. He sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, his fingers curled around the armrest of his chair. His well-tailored suit, his gold cufflinks, his polished courtroom demeanor, none of it mattered anymore, because across the room, Maya Brooks had just destroyed the foundation of his case. She had walked into this courtroom as a teenager no one took seriously, but now everyone was paying attention. The jury, the reporters in the gallery. Even Judge Patterson, who had started this trial with thinly veiled skepticism, now watched her with a newfound intensity. She had turned the tables, and Reynolds knew it. As the courtroom adjourned for the day, he stood from his chair, adjusting his cuffs, his expression unreadable. But as Maya gathered her notes, carefully stacking her papers, she felt his gaze on her. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what he was thinking. This isn't over. The envelope was waiting for her when she got home. Maya had barely stepped into the small but cozy apartment she shared with her grandmother before she noticed it, a thin, cream-colored envelope lying just inside the door. Her stomach tightened. Clara, who had been stirring a pot of soup in the kitchen, noticed immediately. She switched off the stove and walked over, her sharp, watchful eyes landing on the envelope. Maya bent down slowly, picking it up with careful fingers. The weight of it felt wrong, too light, too deliberate. She unfolded the paper, scanning the printed words, and felt it before she fully registered what she was reading, that creeping sensation, that awareness that someone was watching, that realization that this wasn't just a letter. It was a message, a warning. Withdraw from the case. This is your only warning. The words were typed, neat, cold, precise. This wasn't a sloppy handwritten threat from an angry landlord. This was something calculated, professional, someone had made. Sure, there were no fingerprints, no way to trace where it had come from. Maya's fingers tightened around the paper. Her heart slowed. Her grandmother studied her carefully. Well? Maya exhaled, rolling her shoulders back. Then she folded the letter neatly and placed it beside her files. We stick to the plan. Clara studied her for a moment longer. Then she simply nodded. Good. The next morning, as Maya walked into courtroom 4B, she felt it immediately. The change. The energy in the room had shifted, more hostile, more focused. She wasn't an amusing curiosity anymore. She wasn't just some teenager playing lawyer. She was a threat, and everyone in the room knew it now. She walked to her seat with the same measured steps as before, her files tucked securely under her arm. But as she placed them on the defense table, she caught movement from the corner of her eye. Cole was already watching her. And this time, his usual smugness had changed. He was still smiling, but not in the way he usually did. Not polished courtroom arrogance. Not a smirk of victory. This was something else. Something sharper. More dangerous. And Maya, sharp as ever, knew immediately. He had something planned. She didn't react, didn't flinch. She simply pulled out her notebook and pen, her face an unreadable mask. Judge Patterson entered a moment later, and the room rose to attention. The moment he settled into his seat, Cole made his move. Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to present newly discovered evidence. Maya's fingers stilled over the pages of her notebook. She didn't look up immediately. She knew what they were doing. They were trying to bury her in last-minute motions, hoping she wouldn't be able to counter them in time, but they had underestimated her. Again, Judge Patterson adjusted his glasses. Mr. Cole, what kind of evidence? Cole smiled slightly, lifting a thick file and handing it to the bailiff. Financial records. Maya's expression didn't change. Cole continued, his voice silk-smooth and rehearsed. These documents suggest that Miss Carter has been receiving undisclosed income, which calls into question her claims of financial hardship. A ripple of reaction moved through the jury. Maya felt Teresa tense beside her. They were trying to paint Teresa as dishonest, trying to turn this case from a fight against wrongful eviction into a debate about whether Teresa had lied about her financial struggles. It was an old trick, and it was dangerous. Maya took a slow breath, reaching for the file. Then she rose to her feet. Your Honor, I'd like a moment to review this evidence. Judge Patterson nodded. Proceed. Maya took the file, flipping through the pages carefully, methodically. She let the numbers swim before her eyes, her mind snapping into place like a machine. Then she saw it, a critical, damning mistake. It was something only someone who had studied financial law as obsessively as she had would catch. Buried deep in the financial documents, amid the bank statements and supposed evidence of undisclosed income, was something that didn't belong. A transaction, one that had nothing to do with Teresa, one that linked directly to a shell company Maya had read about months ago. She had come across it in a case study on fraudulent evictions, a company used by predatory landlords to create false rental histories and falsify tenant debts. And it was right here, in the middle of the evidence Cole had just submitted. Maya's pulse didn't quicken. She didn't give anything away. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath, then looked up and locked eyes with Cole. And in that moment, he knew. She had found it. She had seen through the lie, and this time it was her turn to smile. The courtroom fell into silence, thick and suffocating, as Maya's words echoed through the chamber. On the grounds that this financial evidence has been tampered with. For a moment, no one moved. Then, like a slow-building storm, a ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. The jurors exchanged uncertain glances, reporters scribbled furiously, and even Judge Patterson, who had seen his fair share of legal theatrics, leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharpening. Cole, however, was the first to snap back to reality. His smile returned, but it was tighter now, stretched across his face like a mask. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice controlled but noticeably lacking its usual smugness. "That is a serious accusation. Do you have any actual proof, or are you simply trying to create a spectacle?" Maya didn't rush, she didn't flinch. Instead, she picked up the financial report, flipping through its pages with purposeful precision before selecting a specific sheet. Then she walked to the bailiff, handing it over. "Your Honor, I direct your attention to page 12 of the prosecution's submitted evidence." Judge Patterson took the document, his eyes scanning the lines of figures, transactions, and account names. Maya continued, stepping to the center of the courtroom, her voice calm, measured, and dangerously precise. "This document claims that my client, Teresa Carter, has been receiving funds from an unknown account, an account allegedly proving that she has undisclosed income." She turned, facing the jury. "However, if you examine the account number and trace the transaction, you'll find that this money isn't coming from Teresa Carter's bank account at all." She let the statement settle, watching as the weight of her words shifted the atmosphere. A moment ago, this had been a straightforward accusation. Now there was doubt. Reynolds shifted in his seat. His jaw clenched ever so slightly, but it was enough. Cole opened his mouth, perhaps to object, perhaps to stall, but Maya wasn't finished. "Your Honor, the financial records the prosecution has submitted are not just inaccurate, they are fabricated." A gasp from the gallery. Someone in the jury box visibly stiffened. Cole's mask of politeness cracked. "That's a baseless accusation." "Is it?" Maya cut in, turning back to the judge. "Because I took the liberty of investigating this so-called undisclosed income last night, and what I found was interesting." She pulled another document from her meticulously organized files and walked to the bailiff once more. "This is a public business registry search for the entity linked to the suspicious account." The bailiff handed the document to the judge. Maya clasped her hands behind her back, her gaze steady. "The listed account does not belong to my client, Teresa Carter. It belongs to a shell company." The jury shifted, murmurs rising again. "And this shell company?" Maya continued, stepping forward. "It has been linked to multiple fraudulent eviction cases in Chicago." A thunderous silence followed. Judge Patterson's brows furrowed deeply as he examined the document. Cole was suddenly very still. Maya tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but unrelenting. "And, Your Honor, if you look further into this business registry, you'll notice something else." A pause. Then she said it. "This company is owned by Richard Reynolds." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shouts, the sound of a reporter frantically snapping a photo of Reynolds' expression. Even the jury, who had been carefully neutral all morning, couldn't hide their shock. Reynolds went rigid, his fingers tightening into fists. Cole's reaction was even better. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Reynolds, then at the judge, his carefully crafted strategy collapsing right in front of him. Judge Patterson let out a slow, sharp exhale, tapping his gavel once for silence, but his gaze was burning into Cole. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice dangerously low, "do you have an explanation for this?" Cole straightened his tie, his expression blank. "Your Honor, under oath." The words landed like a knife. For the first time since the trial began, Cole hesitated. He had been playing offense since day one. He had been controlling the narrative, twisting the facts, pushing Maya and Teresa into a corner. But now he was the one cornered. Cole inhaled sharply. Your Honor, I request a recess. Maya let a small, knowing smile slip onto her face. Of course he did. Judge Patterson narrowed his eyes, but after a beat, he nodded. 15-minute recess. The gavel slammed down. The second the judge exited the room, Cole turned sharply to Reynolds. Maya watched them, watched as Reynolds leaned in, his lips pulling back in a barely restrained snarl, his fingers digging into the table. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she didn't need to. She knew exactly what was happening. Cole had failed him. Reynolds had banked on playing dirty, on manipulating the system like he always had. But now the game was different. Because Maya hadn't just exposed the fraud, she had connected it directly to Reynolds. She had turned their biggest counterattack into their biggest liability, and as she calmly sat back down, flipping open her notebook, she knew one thing for certain. Reynolds wasn't worried about losing the case anymore. He was worried about losing everything. And that made him more dangerous than ever. The tension in courtroom 4B was suffocating. The echoes of Maya's accusations still hung in the air, thick and inescapable. The truth was out. Reynolds' scheme had been exposed, and the once unshakable confidence that had radiated from the plaintiff's table had vanished. Richard Reynolds sat motionless, his face drawn and pale, his fingers clenched so tightly around the arms of his chair that his knuckles had turned white. His carefully tailored mask of indifference was cracking, and Maya could see it. Jonathan, Cole, usually the epitome of arrogance, had been reduced to a man scrambling for control. His perfectly pressed suit did little to hide the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly as he sorted through his papers. The jury, once apathetic, was now alert and engaged. The courtroom was no longer on their side. And Cole knew it, which is why as soon as the recess was called, he made his move. Maya barely had time to set her files down before she felt the presence looming over her. Cole had approached her table, standing just close enough to avoid drawing attention, but just far enough to keep his voice low. His tone was smooth, almost amused, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a quiet menace. "You know, Miss Brooks," he murmured, "I've been doing this a long time." Maya didn't respond. She simply turned the page in her notebook, unfazed. Cole chuckled under his breath, but it was a humorless sound. "You're good, I'll give you that. But let's be honest here, this isn't about your client anymore." Maya's pen paused over the paper. She didn't react outwardly, but inside, her instincts flared to life. Cole leaned in slightly, lowering his voice even more. "For you're playing in the big leagues now, sweetheart, and people in power, they don't like being embarrassed." Maya's fingers curled subtly around the edges of her notebook. There it was, the moment she had been expecting, the warning, the veiled threat disguised as legal wisdom. Slowly she looked up, her gaze meeting his. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Cole?" Her voice was soft, dangerous. Cole smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm giving you a choice. Drop this case, walk away, and maybe, just maybe, you'll still have a future in law." A pause. Then, "Keep pushing, and you'll never step foot in a courtroom again." The threat hung between them, silent and heavy. For a long moment, Maya simply stared at him. Then she smiled, not the polite, professional smile she had used earlier, not the smirk she had given when she caught his mistake. This was different. This was the smile of someone who had already won. "That's interesting," she mused, tapping her pen lightly against the table. "Because that almost sounds like a confession." Cole's mask cracked, just for a second. His jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with something cold and ugly. But before he could respond, the doors to the courtroom swung open. The recess was over. Maya sat back, calmly flipping to a fresh page in her notebook. Cole hesitated, then turned sharply on his heel and walked back to his seat. Maya watched him go, her expression unreadable. Because now she knew she had them exactly where she wanted them. As soon as the judge took his seat, Cole stood. But something was wrong. His usual polished confidence was missing. There was an urgency to his movements, a forced control in his voice. And then he said the words that changed everything. "Your Honor, the plaintiff moves to dismiss the case and pursue a private settlement. The words slammed into the room like a wrecking ball. The gallery erupted into whispers. The jurors sat rigid, in their seats. Even Judge Patterson, a man who had presided over hundreds of cases, narrowed his eyes. Maya froze for only a second. Then she was on her feet. "Your Honor, the defense objects." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Patterson turned to her, his gaze sharp. "On what grounds?" Maya took a steady breath, her voice clear and unwavering. "Because the plaintiff isn't trying to end this case. They're trying to escape it." She stepped toward the judge, each step measured and deliberate. "Your Honor, the prosecution has been caught falsifying financial evidence, submitting fraudulent documents, and using illegal tactics to force my client out of her home. If this case is dismissed without consequence, it sets a precedent that landlords like Mr. Reynolds can manipulate the law without accountability." She turned, facing the jury now. "This isn't just about Teresa Carter. This is about every single tenant who has been forced onto the streets under false pretenses, every family who has been manipulated, and every landlord who thinks that money makes them untouchable." A few jurors shifted in their seats, their expressions tightening. She turned back to Judge Patterson, her gaze locked with his. "I move to push forward with criminal charges against the plaintiff." The courtroom erupted, gasps, reporters scrambling for their phones. A juror actually dropped their pen. At the plaintiff's table, Reynolds went rigid. Cole stiffened, his entire body locked with tension. Judge Patterson sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled together, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned to Cole. "Mr. Cole, do you have any objection to this request?" Cole's mouth opened, then closed because he knew. They had lost. By the time the court adjourned, Maya could still feel the weight of their stares. She had pushed too far. She had backed them into a corner, and cornered wolves, they bite. Teresa turned to her, her voice thick with emotion. "Maya." Maya shook her head, giving her a small but firm smile. "We're not done yet." Teresa frowned. "What do you mean?" Maya's eyes flicked toward the plaintiff's table. Reynolds was whispering furiously to Cole, his hands curled into fists, his expression dark. Maya exhaled. She knew men like him, knew they wouldn't just accept defeat. They would retaliate. She turned back to Teresa, her expression hardening. "They're not going to stop." A pause. Then softly, "So neither are we." And as she stepped out of the courtroom, the weight of what she had started pressed down on her. This wasn't just about Teresa anymore. This was about all the people who had been silenced. And Maya. She wasn't just fighting back anymore. She was going to finish this war. The Chicago night was cold and suffocating as Maya and Teresa stepped out of the courthouse. The heavy stone pillars of the building loomed behind them, casting long, jagged shadows under the dim glow of the streetlights. Maya should have felt victorious. She had done the impossible, exposed Reynolds, dismantled Cole's fabricated evidence, and forced the case into criminal proceedings. But she didn't feel relief, because winning against powerful men doesn't mean the fight is over. It means the fight is only just beginning. As they walked across the near-empty parking lot, Maya's senses prickled. The cool wind whistled through the alleyways, rattling loose signs and tossing discarded newspapers across the pavement. She glanced around, scanning the dimly lit rows of parked cars, the alleyways, the darkened windows of surrounding office buildings. Something felt wrong. Her instincts, honed from years of reading between the lines, sensing the dangers that lurked beneath the surface, were screaming at her. She tightened her grip on her satchel, eyes locking onto a black sedan with tinted windows parked near the exit. It hadn't been there earlier, and someone was inside. A faint glow, a cigarette ember burning in the darkness, illuminated the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat. Watching, waiting. Maya slowed her steps, her pulse steady but alert. Beside her, Teresa sighed, completely unaware. "I still can't believe it's over." Maya didn't respond, because it wasn't over. She reached into her satchel, gripping the pepper spray hidden inside, keeping it loose in her hand. They were still several feet from Teresa's car, too far to get in safely without turning their backs. Maya did the only thing she could. She turned toward the sedan and locked eyes with the man inside. Challenge me. For a brief second, the cigarette ember flared. The man took a slow drag, his face partially illuminated. A sharp jawline, dead eyes, a smirk that never quite reached his expression, and then he moved. The car door swung open. Teresa stiffened beside her, her keys jangling as she fumbled for the lock. A man in a dark coat stepped out, his boots echoing against the concrete. Maya's grip on the pepper spray tightened. The man exhaled smoke, flicking his cigarette to the ground before crushing it under his heel. Casual, calculated. He wasn't rushing toward them. He wasn't brandishing a weapon, but that made it worse, because his deliberate, unhurried approach meant he wasn't afraid. This wasn't a mugging, this was a message. The man stopped a few feet away, adjusting the cuffs of his gloves, as if this was just another night for him. Then he spoke. Maya Brooks. His voice was deep, rough, like gravel under heavy boots. Maya didn't blink. "Who's asking?" The man smirked. "You've made some powerful enemies, kid." Teresa sucked in a sharp breath beside her. "Maya, let's go." Maya didn't move, didn't back down. Her voice was flat. "If you're here to threaten me, get in line." The man chuckled. "No threats, just advice." He took a step closer. Teresa flinched, gripping her keys so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Maya stood firm. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," the man continued. "But you're playing in the big leagues now, and people in power, they don't like being embarrassed." Maya narrowed her eyes. "Is that supposed to scare me?" The man's smirk didn't waver. "No, it's supposed to make you think." He took another drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly. "People like Reynolds, they don't lose, and when they do, they don't lose quietly." Maya didn't answer, didn't react, because she knew he was right. The man watched her for a long moment before flicking the cigarette away and shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "Walk away while you still can. It'd be a shame if something happened." And just like that, he turned and walked back to his car. The sedan rolled out of the lot slowly, deliberately, headlights cutting through the darkness like a warning. Maya's heartbeat thudded against her ribs. They had made their next move, and she had just stepped into dangerous territory. That night, Maya sat at her desk, her lamp casting a warm glow over the scattered case files, notes, and financial records. Her mind replayed the day's events in loops. The Sao trial, the threat, the shadowed figure in the parking lot, then a noise, soft, faint, but unmistakable. Her breath caught. Her fingers hovered over her laptop as she listened, a slow, deliberate creak of the front door. Her stomach turned to ice. Someone was inside. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant sound of a car passing by outside. Maya's fingers froze over her laptop keyboard. The noise had been subtle, too subtle for an accident. A slow, deliberate creak of the front door. Someone was inside. Her heart slowed, not in fear, but in focus. She glanced at the clock on her desk. 1:42 a.m. Clara was asleep down the hall. The apartment was small. One hallway, 2 bedrooms, 1 exit. Whoever had entered was between her and the front door. Her grip tightened around the heavy law textbook on her desk. 200 pages of criminal and civil codes. It was the closest thing to a weapon she had. She reached for her phone with her free hand, and then another sound. Softer. Careful footsteps on the hardwood floor. The air felt thicker, like the walls themselves had become aware of the danger creeping through them. Maya's mind snapped into survival mode. She couldn't call 911. The intruder would hear the voice on the other end. No time. She needed to act first. She took a slow, measured breath and rose from her chair silently. She moved toward the hallway, her back pressed against the wall, her muscles coiled and ready. A shadow moved in the dim light, and then a man stepped into view. He was tall, dressed in all black, gloves covering his hands, a mask obscuring the lower half of his face. Not a thief. He wasn't looking for valuables. He was looking for her. Maya's pulse remained steady. She didn't hesitate. She swung the book with everything she had. The thick volume slammed into the intruder's ribs, the impact sending a loud thud through the apartment. The man staggered back, cursing under his breath. But he was fast, too fast. He recovered, his hand darting toward his belt. A weapon. Maya didn't wait to find out. She grabbed the nearest object, a ceramic mug from the kitchen counter, and hurled it straight at his head. The man ducked, but the distraction gave her just enough time. She spun on her heels and sprinted toward the hallway, straight to the emergency alarm installed just outside her grandmother's room. 2 more steps. The intruder lunged. Maya barely made it. She slammed her hand against the emergency alarm. A blaring siren exploded through the apartment, shaking the walls, filling every corner with piercing, wailing noise. The intruder froze. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, he ran. Maya chased him to the front door, just in time to see him disappear into the night. She stood there breathing hard, adrenaline still pumping through her veins, but she wasn't shaken. She wasn't scared. She was furious. She turned, and there in the hallway stood Clara, her robe pulled tightly around her, her face pale. Maya, what just happened? Maya exhaled slowly, hands still clenched into fists. She knew exactly who had sent him. She turned back toward the doorway, staring into the empty night. Then quietly, too quietly, she said, "They just made a mistake." The police had come and gone. A report had been filed. Officers had taken pictures, dusted for fingerprints that they knew wouldn't be there. Maya sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of tea beside her, her laptop open, its screen casting a faint glow against her face. Clara sat across from her, arms folded, watching her carefully. "Maya, whatever you're thinking, I'm going to take them apart." Her grandmother sighed. "You need to be careful." Maya didn't look up. "I am." Clara leaned forward. "No, you think you are. But you're not just dealing with the law anymore." Maya's fingers typed faster. "They broke into our home, Clara. They want to scare me. They want me to back down." She stopped typing, looked up. "But I don't back down." Clara exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Maya, listen to me. This isn't just about Teresa anymore. It's bigger than that. You're digging into powerful people. And powerful people don't like to lose." Maya's jaw tightened. "Good. Then they can feel what it's like for once." She turned back to her laptop, scrolling through public records, business filings, tax reports. She wasn't just looking for Reynolds now. She was looking for everyone connected to him, and she found them. Shell companies, fake business addresses, contracts with suspiciously large payments. Money moved between accounts that didn't exist. She traced a pattern, one that led to evictions just like Teresa's all across the city. Reynolds wasn't just a slumlord. He was part of a machine that needed to be dismantled. She picked up her phone, scanned her contact list, then she pressed call. A tired voice answered on the other end. "Maya? It's 2 in the morning. Aaron, I need you to hack into something for me." A long pause. Then, "What the hell did you get yourself into this? Time?" By the time Maya closed her laptop, dawn was breaking over the city skyline. Her desk was covered in notes, maps, printouts, legal citations, but her mind was clear. She finally understood. This wasn't just about one case. It wasn't just about Teresa. This was systemic, corrupt, deep-rooted. She had a choice. She could walk away. Or she could burn it all down. Maya glanced at the emergency alarm on the wall, the one that had saved her life tonight. Then she reached for her phone again. This time she wasn't calling a friend. She was calling a journalist. The second the line picked up, she didn't hesitate. "I have a story for you." The apartment was dead silent except for the faint hum of Maya's laptop fan, a soft white noise that barely filled the tense space. The desk lamp cast a harsh glow over the chaos of documents spread across the wooden surface, printed financial reports, property transactions, eviction notices, every single piece of paper linking Richard Reynolds to fraud and corruption. Maya had been up all night, no longer than that. For days she had been digging, cross-referencing, uncovering more than she had ever imagined. What started as an illegal eviction scheme had snowballed into something far worse. Reynolds wasn't just exploiting tenants. He was laundering money, creating fake companies to move funds, using ghost properties to hide his fraudulent activity. And she had proof. Now, all she needed was a megaphone. Her fingers hovered over the phone screen. She scrolled past the usual contacts. Teresa, Aaron, Clara, until she reached the number she needed. Tyler Walsh, investigative journalist, the kind of man who had ripped apart politicians, exposed corporate fraud, and made powerful enemies. She pressed call. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a groggy voice answered. "Who the hell is this? Do you know what time it is?" Maya didn't flinch. "Tyler Walsh?" A pause. Then a sigh. "Yeah, who's asking?" Maya took a breath. "I have a story for you." The silence that followed was different. Not confusion, interest. Tyler's voice sharpened. "What kind of story?" Maya's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "A citywide eviction scam, fraudulent real estate deals, shell companies funneling money to slumlords, and the man running it all?" She let the words settle. Richard Reynolds. The silence on the other end stretched longer this time. Then a sharp inhale. "Shit." Maya's lips curled slightly. "You interested?" Walsh was too smart to agree on the phone. Instead, he gave her a location, a time, a warning. "Be careful, kid. If you're telling the truth, Reynolds won't just sit back and watch you burn him." Maya knew that already, but she didn't have time to be afraid. The next afternoon, she arrived 10 minutes early to their meeting place, a small downtown cafe, one of those corporate spots where businessmen had hushed conversations over overpriced coffee. It was perfect, public enough to be safe, private enough to talk. She took a seat in the corner booth, her back to the wall, eyes scanning the room. She was watching for anything suspicious, a man in a suit looking at her too long, a customer. Leaving their coffee untouched, a car parked across the street with its engine still running. Reynolds had already sent someone to threaten her once. She wasn't going to let it happen again. The bell above the door jingled, and Tyler Walsh walked in. He looked exactly how she imagined, messy hair, 5 o'clock shadow, tired eyes that had seen too much. He spotted her immediately, no hesitation, no small talk. He dropped into the seat across from her and cut straight to the point. "All right, kid, you dragged me out here. Start talking." Maya didn't blink, didn't hesitate. She reached into her bag and slid a manila folder across the table. Walsh arched a brow, flipping it open. For the first 30 seconds, he read in silence. Then his fingers tightened around the pages. His jaw clenched. Maya leaned forward, lowering her voice. "That's just the start." Walsh looked up. His voice was flat, serious. "Where the hell did you get this?" Maya smirked. "Does it matter?" Walsh exhaled, shaking his head. This isn't just a case. This is a goddamn bombshell." She tapped the folder. "You're going to publish it?" Walsh hesitated for half a second. Then he nodded. "This kind of corruption, I'd be an idiot if I didn't." Maya's pulse thrummed. She had him. The problem with men like Richard Reynolds, they don't lose quietly, and they definitely don't wait for the attack. He was already planning his counterstrike, so Maya had to strike first. That night, she sat in her apartment, staring at her half-smashed phone screen. The intruder had been the first move. The journalist was the second. Now she had to force Reynolds's hand. She crafted an email. The subject line, impossible to ignore. Final offer, face me or watch your empire burn. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. And he took it. 2 days later, Maya stood outside the glass fortress that was Reynolds' corporate office. The towering skyscraper gleamed under the city lights, a monument to stolen money. Her heartbeat was steady. She wasn't afraid, because for the first time, Reynolds wasn't in control. She stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The receptionist barely looked up before guiding her to the top floor. The doors opened to an office larger than most apartments, walls lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city he thought he owned. And there he was, Richard Reynolds, calm, too calm, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, sipping whiskey, as if he had invited her for a casual chat. He turned, eyes flicking over her as if she was something small, insignificant. "Miss Brooks." Maya didn't smile, didn't sit. She placed the flash drive on his desk. "That's everything." Reynolds studied it for a long moment. Then slowly he smirked. "You think this is enough to stop me?" Maya tilted her head. "No." I think it's enough to bury you." A flash of irritation flickered across his face. He leaned back, exhaling. "You know, I could have had you disappear weeks ago. It would have been easier." Maya's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. "And yet, here I am." Reynolds's smirk returned. "Do you know how the real world works, girl? Money doesn't disappear, it just moves." Maya smiled for the first time. "Then I guess I'll just have to follow it." The tension between them crackled. Then she turned on her heel and walked out. And as she stepped onto the elevator, she knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Maya sat hunched over a dimly lit desk, her fingers flying over her keyboard in Aaron's cramped apartment. The air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and exhaustion. The only sounds in the room the soft hum of multiple monitors and the rapid-fire clicks of Aaron's keyboard. Papers were scattered across the desk, printouts of financial reports, eviction notices, wire transfers, all linked by a single common thread, Reynolds. But they needed more. Fraud wasn't enough. To take down someone like Reynolds, they needed a direct link to a federal crime. Maya's eyes burned as she squinted at the screen, scanning through endless rows of numbers and transaction records. Aaron, sitting beside her, suddenly let out a low whistle. Maya turned to him instantly. "What?" Aaron leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "You're not gonna like this." She moved closer. The monitor flickered as he highlighted a series of offshore transactions, millions of dollars being funneled through a shell company called Harmony Solutions. Maya stilled. That name. She knew it. Frantically, she rifled through the stack of papers until she found it. A fraudulent lease termination notice issued to Teresa. Right at the bottom, under fine print, was the name Harmony Solutions. Maya's pulse spiked. Reynolds is using fake companies to evict tenants, then transferring those properties to his own shell corporations. He's flipping them under different names to clean the money. Aaron clicked through more files. "It's bigger than that. Some of these accounts are flagged by international financial regulators. The Caymans, Switzerland. Somebody's already watching him." Maya leaned back, exhaling sharply. They weren't just looking at fraud anymore. This was money laundering, tax evasion. This was enough to bury Reynolds permanently. But how did it connect to Cole? Aaron continued digging, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Then he froze. "Shit." Maya turned back to the screen. "What now?" Aaron highlighted a series of deposits, and there it was, Jonathan Cole, paid 6 figures right before multiple fraudulent evictions were filed. Maya exhaled slowly, her mind racing. "Cole isn't just defending Reynolds, he's part of it." She glanced at Aaron. "Can you access his personal accounts?" Aaron cracked his knuckles. "You doubt me?" Every empire had a weak point, and Reynolds wasn't him. It was his lawyer, Jonathan. Cole was the middleman, the one who processed the dirty transactions, the one who made everything look legal on paper. But now, he was exposed. Maya tapped her fingers against the desk, thinking fast. "We can't just expose him yet. If Cole gets wind of this, he'll run." Aaron nodded. "So we make him panic first." Maya's lips curled. "Let's start turning up the heat." They spent the next few hours crafting an anonymous tip. It had to be subtle, just enough to get the federal authorities interested, but not enough for Cole to realize it was planted. A single email, sent from an encrypted source, landing directly in the inbox of a federal financial investigator. Subject: Urgent financial irregularities in real estate transactions. Dear federal agent's name, you may want to investigate offshore transactions linked to Harmony Solutions, a shell company with multiple fraudulent property acquisitions. The money trail leads back to one financial consultant, Jonathan Cole. There are discrepancies in account transfers, suggesting potential money laundering and tax fraud. If you follow the money, you'll find what you're looking for, a concerned citizen. Aaron hit send, and just like that, the first domino fell. Now they waited. Less than 48 hours later, Maya sat in a small corner cafe, hood pulled low, scrolling through legal news forums on a burner laptop. The air smelled of stale espresso and cheap pastries, and the radio in the background played a song she barely registered. Then she saw it. A short paragraph buried deep in a financial crime blog, something that wouldn't make headlines but would make the right people nervous. Federal auditors have reportedly flagged suspicious transactions in offshore accounts connected to high-profile real estate cases. While no names have been publicly disclosed, sources indicate that at least one prominent legal consultant may be involved. Maya's pulse quickened. She took a slow sip of her coffee, forcing her expression to stay neutral. Cole was in trouble. Now she had to make sure he knew it. That night, her burner phone buzzed. Unknown number, Maya answered. A pause. Then a familiar voice, low, controlled, but with an unmistakable edge of panic. Jonathan Cole. "We need to talk." Maya leaned back against the motel headboard, tapping a rhythm on her knee. "Do we?" Cole's exhale was sharp, angry. "Don't play games with me, Brooks. I know you're behind this." Maya smirked, though her voice remained neutral. "Behind what exactly?" "The feds, the leaks, the goddamn articles." His voice dropped, edged with tension. "You don't know what you've started." Maya let the silence stretch. Then, softly, "You sound nervous, Cole." His tone darkened. "You should be too. Reynolds doesn't take kindly to loose ends." Maya went still. There it was. Cole wasn't just worried about the investigation. He was scared of Reynolds. Maya straightened. "You called me, Cole." "Why?" A pause. Then, quieter, more desperate. "I need a way out." They met in an underground parking garage, the kind of place where people handled business they didn't want seen. The air smelled of damp concrete and oil, shadows stretching long under the dim, flickering lights. Cole was already there, leaning against his car, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. For the first time, he looked like a man unraveling. His usual confidence was stripped away, replaced with tension, paranoia. He turned as she approached, his eyes darting around like he was expecting someone to be watching. "This is a mistake." Maya stopped a few feet away. "Then why are you here?" Cole ran a hand down his face. "Because I'm screwed, that's why. The feds are digging into me, and Reynolds—" He swallowed hard, then shook his head. Maya's gaze sharpened. "He threatened you, didn't he?" Cole said nothing, but the answer was there. Maya took a slow step closer. "Then make a new choice." Silence. Then Cole reached into his jacket, pulled out a flash drive, and handed it to her. His voice was barely above a whisper. "This is everything. If I go down, I'm not going alone." Maya took the drive she had won, and now it was time to end this. Maya sat in the dim glow of her motel room, staring at the small, unassuming flash drive in her palm. The cheap bedside lamp flickered, casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Outside, the hum of late night traffic drifted in through the window, the occasional honk breaking the silence. She had held countless case files, lease agreements, and forged documents in her hands before, but none of them felt as heavy as this tiny piece of plastic and metal. This was more than evidence. It was a death sentence for Reynolds. Her heart pounded steadily, but her fingers remained calm as she turned the flash drive over in her palm. She had won the battle in the shadows. Now it was time to bring the war into the light. She reached for her burner phone and dialed the only number that mattered. The phone rang once, twice. Then, a voice, sharp and eager. "Tell me you've got something." Maya's lips curled into a faint smile. "I have everything." A brief silence. Then Walsh exhaled. "Meet me, now." Maya pulled her hood tighter around her face as she walked toward the designated meeting spot, a rundown parking lot behind a 24-hour diner. The air smelled of grease and gasoline, the neon sign above flickering as if it was about to die. Walsh was already there, sitting in his car, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. His usual disheveled appearance was even worse, shirt wrinkled, eyes bloodshot from too much coffee and too little sleep. Maya slid into the passenger seat and handed him the flash drive without a word. Walsh plugged it into his laptop, and as the files loaded, his expression shifted. First shock, then anger, and finally realization. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, scrolling through the transactions. "This isn't just fraud. This is organized crime." Maya folded her arms. "I told you." Walsh shook his head, muttering under his breath. Bribes to city officials, millions funneled through offshore accounts. He's been paying off inspectors, real estate developers, even a few politicians. He let out a dry laugh. This is bigger than I thought. Maya tilted her head slightly. Can. You make sure this story lands exactly where it needs to. Walsh looked up, meeting her gaze. By the time I'm done, Reynolds won't just be ruined, he'll be radioactive. Maya smirked. Good. Let's bury him. The fallout was immediate. Within 24 hours, the media erupted. Headlines dominated national news outlets. Exclusive. Billionaire landlord Richard Reynolds exposed in massive fraud and money laundering. Scheme. The article left nothing out. It detailed everything. The illegal evictions, the fraudulent lease violations, the offshore accounts used to launder millions. More importantly, it named names. City officials, property developers, even a few well-known real estate investors implicated in the scheme. The public reaction was explosive. Protests erupted outside Reynolds' corporate offices. Tenants who had been illegally evicted started coming forward with their stories. And, behind the scenes, the federal government took notice. Reports surfaced that the FBI had issued subpoenas for several corporations tied to Reynolds' empire. For the first time, Reynolds wasn't the one in control. And Maya? She watched it all unfold from the shadows. Maya knew Reynolds wouldn't go down without a fight, so she wasn't surprised when, 2 nights later, she noticed the black sedan trailing her. She had switched motels twice, changed burner phones, and varied her routes. Yet they still found her. She walked steadily, her senses on high alert, her pulse a steady drum against her ribs. She turned the corner, slipping into a dimly lit alleyway. The footsteps followed. Her fingers tightened around the small knife she had been carrying in her pocket. Then she saw them. 2 men, tall, built, moving with trained efficiency. These weren't just street thugs. Reynolds had sent professionals. Maya's heart pounded, but her mind was sharp, calculating. She reached for the trash lid beside her and, in one swift motion, flung it at the nearest man's knee. A sharp grunt, a stumble, a moment of hesitation. She bolted. Her feet pounded against the pavement, breath sharp and controlled. The neon lights of a liquor store blurred past as she sprinted across the street, narrowly missing an oncoming car. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. She darted into a subway entrance, blending into the crowd. By the time she reached the platform, they were gone. But the message was clear. Reynolds wasn't just fighting to save his reputation anymore. He was fighting to erase her. The next morning, a new headline broke. Former Reynolds attorney cooperating with federal investigation. Maya sat in a small diner, her fingers tight around a coffee cup as she read the article. Cole had flipped, faced with imminent arrest. He had cut a deal with federal prosecutors, offering full testimony in exchange for immunity. He provided emails, recordings, financial statements, enough to rip Reynolds' entire operation apart. Maya exhaled slowly. Now Reynolds was out of options, and that made him more dangerous than ever. She knew it would happen, and when it did, she was ready. It was just past midnight when she heard the knock on her motel door. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she grabbed the knife she had stolen from the motel kitchen and hid it behind her back. Then slowly she opened the door. Reynolds stood there, not a thug, not a hired hitman. Him. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, were now full of something else. Desperation. You ruined me, Reynolds murmured. Maya tilted her head slightly. No, Richard, you did that yourself. A slow, bitter laugh. Do you have any idea what you've done? Maya crossed her arms. Yeah, I ended you. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken threats. Then, finally, Reynolds sighed, rubbing his face. Tell me what you want. Maya's lips curled. You don't have anything left to give me. His expression darkened. People like me don't stay buried forever. Maya smiled. Then I'll be here when you crawl back up. The next morning, Maya watched the news as FBI agents led Reynolds out of his mansion in handcuffs. The once untouchable billionaire was now just another criminal. She turned off the TV and picked up her bag. It was over, for now. But Maya knew the war against corruption never truly ended, and if another battle came, she'd be ready. She always was. Maya sat at her desk, staring at the screen filled with names, bank accounts, offshore transactions, and falsified eviction notices. This was it. The entire foundation of Reynolds' empire laid bare. She had spent weeks piecing this together. Every shady deal, every illegal eviction, every corrupt official on his payroll. But now, it was time to use it. Reynolds thought he was untouchable. He had spent years bending the system to his will, but tonight the system was going to break him. She picked up her phone and called Aaron. "Are we ready?" Aaron's voice was tight with anticipation. "Everything's set. Once you make your move, we hit send on the files. Press, law enforcement, watchdog organizations, they'll all get it at once." Maya nodded, exhaling. "It's time." She grabbed her bag, slipped the USB into her pocket, and headed out the door. Tonight, she was ending Richard Reynolds. Reynolds wasn't just going to walk into a courtroom and confess. Narco men like him didn't go down without a fight, which meant Maya had to force his hand. She had learned one thing about Reynolds during this case. He underestimated people he thought were beneath him, and that was his greatest weakness. So she set a trap. She planted false information, letting it slip through certain channels that she had one final piece of evidence, something so explosive it could bring not just him, but his entire network crumbling down. She leaked it carefully, strategically, and within hours it worked. Reynolds' lawyers reached out immediately, offering a private settlement. That wasn't what Maya wanted. She wanted him desperate, so she declined. And just like she predicted, Reynolds took the bait. He arranged a meeting. No lawyers, no press, just him. It was exactly what Maya needed, because tonight the hunter was about to become the hunted. Maya arrived at the private conference room in a downtown high-rise. Reynolds was already there, sitting at the head of the table, his fingers tapping against the wood, his face unreadable. Beside him, his most trusted advisor, Jonathan Cole. Maya sat down across from them, sliding a thin folder onto the table. Reynolds smirked. "You've been quite the nuisance, Miss Brooks." Maya tilted her head. "Funny. I was just about to say the same about you." He chuckled, leaning forward. "Let's cut the theatrics. You want something, I want something. Let's make a deal." Maya opened the folder. Inside were doctored versions of the real documents, close enough to seem real but missing key details. Reynolds' eyes flickered over them. Then he smiled. How much? There it was. The moment of truth. He was willing to pay her off, a direct bribe. Maya tapped her fingers against the table, pretending to consider. "Depends," she said slowly. "How much?" "Is your freedom worth?" Reynolds chuckled, then gave a small nod to Cole. A briefcase appeared. Cash. Maya's stomach twisted, but she kept her face neutral. This wasn't just an offer, it was evidence. Aaron had been recording everything remotely. Maya had just caught Reynolds red-handed, and just as she was about to respond, the doors burst open. FBI agents swarmed the room, weapons drawn. "Richard Reynolds, you're under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit illegal evictions." Reynolds froze. His smirk disappeared. Cole shot up from his seat. "This is outrageous." An agent stepped forward, holding up a warrant. "We have recorded evidence of Mr. Reynolds attempting to bribe Miss Brooks to suppress criminal evidence. That, along with the fraud charges, is enough to take him in." Maya leaned back, arms crossed. Checkmate. Reynolds' face turned red with fury, but there was nothing he could do. As the agent slapped handcuffs onto his wrists, he turned to Maya, his eyes burning with hatred. "You have no idea what you've done." Maya smiled. "Oh, I know exactly what I've done." Reynolds was dragged away, and just like that, the king had fallen. Within hours, the headlines exploded. Billionaire Richard Reynolds arrested in real estate corruption scandal. Illegal evictions, fraud, and bribery. The fall of an empire. 17-year-old Maya Brooks takes down a real estate mogul. Social media erupted. Some people celebrated her. Some people hated her. She didn't care. Because the truth? She hadn't done this for fame. She had done this for justice. And she had won. Maya knew that getting Reynolds arrested wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Because one man going to prison didn't erase the damage he had done. Families were still homeless. Communities were still broken. The system that let men like him exist was still intact. But Maya wasn't just here to win a case. She was here to change everything. And this was just step one. Maya stood in a crowded community hall, looking out at a room full of people. People who had lost everything. People who had been ignored. People who for the first time believed that they could fight back. She stepped forward, voice steady. Reynolds is gone, but the fight isn't over. Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Maya lifted her chin. That's why we're starting something new. A movement to take on corruption, to defend families like Teresa's, to make sure no one else has to fight alone. She turned, pointing to the banner behind her, the Justice Collective. And with those words, a movement was born. Maya had learned something about power. When you take it from the wrong people, they don't just let it go. One night, as she locked up the Justice Collective's office, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it, then answered. Silence. Then, a voice. You've made a lot of enemies, Miss Brooks. Maya's grip tightened. You're playing a dangerous game. Walk away now while you still can. She exhaled slowly. Then she smiled. Come and stop me. She hung up and walked away, because the war was never over. And Maya, she was just getting started. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Spectators filled every seat, while reporters crowded the back, whispering to each other as they clutched their notepads. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. Maya sat beside Teresa, both of them stone-faced, unwilling to show any signs of weakness. Across the room, Richard Reynolds sat rigidly at the defendant's table. Despite his tailored suit and his high-priced legal team, his face was pale. He knew. Everyone knew. Judge Patterson cleared his throat, the sound echoing across the silent room. Then, in a voice that was firm and final, he spoke. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Teresa Carter. A single breath of stunned silence. Then, chaos. Gasps, whispers. A strangled noise from Reynolds. But Judge Patterson wasn't finished. His gaze hardened, turning toward Reynolds with the kind of sharp authority that left no room for argument. Furthermore, based on the evidence provided, this court finds sufficient grounds to refer Mr. Reynolds for criminal investigation into fraud, illegal evictions, and financial misconduct. Maya closed her eyes for a brief second. It was over. Beside her, Teresa let out a shuddering breath, her hands trembling. Maya squeezed them gently. We did it! Teresa turned to her, her eyes shining with unshed tears. No, Maya, you did it. Maya didn't respond, because she knew the truth. This was never just about one case. This was about all of them, and she wasn't done yet. The community center was packed beyond expectation. Hundreds of people had come, not just from this city, but from neighboring towns and states. Some were victims of corrupt landlords. Some were activists, ready to fight. Some were lawyers, eager to use their knowledge for something bigger. And standing at the front of it all, Maya. She cleared her throat, her voice steady but electric with conviction. The system is broken, and for too long it has been built to serve the powerful while crushing those without a voice. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. She continued, Richard Reynolds was just one man, but there are more like him. More landlords, more politicians, more corporations who think they can play with people's lives and never face consequences. Her eyes scanned the room. Not anymore. She turned, gesturing to the banner behind her. The Justice Collective isn't just about one case. It's about all of them. It's about making sure no one else has to fight alone. Applause erupted. Maya exhaled. This wasn't just about her fight anymore. This was about everyone's fight. And she had just lit the first spark of something unstoppable. But victory never came without consequences. Late one night, Maya was the last to leave the office. The Justice Collective had only been operational for a few weeks, but the work was already piling up. As she locked the door behind her, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She frowned, staring at the screen. She had been getting more and more of these calls lately. Slowly, she picked up. "Hello?" For a moment, silence. Then, a voice, low, calm, controlled. "You should have stopped with Reynolds, Miss Brooks." Her fingers clenched around the phone. "Who is this?" A soft chuckle. "Someone who's giving you a chance to walk away before you step into something bigger than you can handle." Maya's jaw tightened. "I don't scare easy." The voice didn't waver. "No, but people around you do. You keep pushing and you won't be the only one who pays the price." Her stomach hardened. She knew what this was, a warning, a test. But they had made one critical mistake. They thought she would run. She exhaled slowly, voice sharp and unshaken. "Come and try." A brief silence. Then, the call disconnected. Maya stared at the phone for a moment before slipping it back into her pocket. And then, she walked away. No hesitation, no fear, because she had already made her choice. She wasn't walking away. She was walking straight into the fire. Maya had proven something no one wanted to believe. That age, race, and background didn't determine intelligence, strength, or power. That one voice, one 17-year-old girl, could stand against a corrupt system and win. Her story spread across the country. Young activists began organizing. Journalists began digging deeper. Politicians started paying attention. Maya had changed the game, but she knew the truth. This wasn't the end. There would always be another fight. There would always be another system trying to silence people like her, but she was ready. She pulled out her phone and called Walsh. He picked up instantly. "What's next?" Maya smirked. "We go bigger." A pause. Then Walsh laughed. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Maya exhaled, looking out over the city. Because the war was never over, and Maya, she was just getting started. The end, for now. The story of Maya Brooks is more than just a legal battle against a corrupt real estate mogul. It is a testament to resilience, courage, and the power of standing up against injustice. Through her journey, we can extract several key lessons that apply not only to the fight for housing rights, but to any battle against systemic corruption. Power is not absolute. It thrives on fear and silence. One of the biggest takeaways from this story is that those in power only remain untouchable if no one dares to challenge them. Reynolds, Langford, and other corrupt figures in the story believed they were invincible because they had money, influence, and control over the system. But Maya proved that when people refuse to stay silent, even the most powerful figures can fall. The moment she exposed the truth, their foundation of lies collapsed. This is a lesson we see time and time again in history. Corruption does not die easily, but it only thrives when people are too afraid to speak out. The only way to change the system is to confront it head-on, despite the risks. 2. The justice system is flawed, but it can be challenged. Maya's struggle highlights a harsh reality. The justice system does not always serve those who need it the most. It is often designed to protect the wealthy and well-connected, while the marginalized struggle to fight back. But this does not mean justice is impossible. Maya didn't have a law degree, but she had knowledge, determination, and a refusal to back down. She found the loopholes, exposed the corruption, and forced the system to work the way it was supposed to. This teaches us that the law can be a tool for justice, but only if people are willing to use it against those who abuse it. Change starts with one person, but it takes a movement to keep it going. Maya's journey started with one case, one woman who was unfairly evicted. But by the end of the story, her fight had ignited a nationwide movement. This is how change happens. It starts with a single voice. But if that voice is loud enough, others will join. If enough people stand up, the system has no choice but to change. Maya's story reminds us that one person's courage can inspire thousands. But true change comes when those thousands stand together. When you challenge corruption, it will fight back. Maya didn't just face legal battles, she faced threats, smear campaigns and powerful enemies who wanted to silence her. This is the price of exposing corruption. Those who hold power do not give it up easily. They will try to discredit, threaten, or even destroy those who challenge them. But Maya's story also teaches us the importance of perseverance. She didn't back down when she was threatened. She used their attacks against them and emerged stronger. The lesson: if you are fighting for something that matters, expect resistance, but never let it stop you. Maya Brooks's journey is one of inspiration, defiance, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It is a reminder that corruption thrives when people do nothing, but it falls when even one person dares to stand against it. Her story is not just about legal battles or activism. It is about the power of individuals to create change, the resilience required to fight against overwhelming odds, and the importance of never backing down in the face of injustice. And perhaps the most powerful lesson? This fight never truly ends. There will always be another Reynolds, another Langford, another system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the weak. But as long as there are people like Maya, people who refuse to be silent, who refuse to back down, the fight for justice will never be lost, because one voice can spark a movement, and one movement can change everything.